Hi, this is Jason with Violator Comics Collectibles coming at you with another game review, and this time we're taking a look at the SEGA 32X. This is an add-on console for the Sega Genesis released by Sega in 1994. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at the history, then we'll take a look at the system and some of the games that are available for it. Sega of Japan wanted a 32-bit cartridge-based system that would be released by the holidays in 1994. They wanted a system to bridge the gap between the Genesis and future Sega systems and keep the company ahead of the competition. After some debate between Sega of America and Sega Japan, they agreed on making the system an add-on to the Sega Genesis. Sega of Japan was already working on what would eventually become the Sega Saturn. Sega of America was unaware of this and was tasked with leading the development of the new add-on system dubbed Project Mars. Project Mars would eventually be called the SEGA 32X in North America, the Mega Drive 32X in Europe, and the Super 32X in Japan, and was presented as a low-cost option for consumers looking to play 32-bit games. The system had two Hitachi 32-bit RISC processors and was capable of 32,768 colors, better sound with two digital sound channels, 3D graphics support and texture mapping using 50,000 polygons per second, and enhanced scaling and rotation. Sega of America had less than a year to get the system to market, causing very tight production timelines for game developers. The 32X was released in North America on November 21st, 1994, at a retail cost of $159.99 with 3 games ready at launch: Star Wars Arcade, Virtual Racing Deluxe, and Doom. The system sold very well at launch, with sales estimated around 600,000 units by the end of 1994, but its momentum was abruptly halted when the Sega Saturn was released in Japan around the same time. Consumers knew that the Sega Saturn would be coming to the US soon. Why would they buy a 32X when the more advanced Saturn was on the horizon? The Sega Saturn arrived in North America 6 months later on May 11, 1995. The writing was on the wall for the 32X, and consumers and developers knew it. 32X was just not worth it. Developers stopped making games for the 32X and switched production to the Sega Saturn. Sega was even producing another console at the time called the Neptune, which was just a standalone 32X Genesis, but it never made it to market. The 32X was discounted in stores down to $99 and eventually the clearance price of $20. By 1996, the 32X was discontinued by Sega, having only sold around 700,000 units worldwide. Taking a look at the system, the Sega 32X is a mushroom-shaped add-on that fits into the cartridge slot of the Sega Genesis video game console. It requires its own power cord and a pass-through cable to work with the Sega Genesis. The system came with a power cord, a pass-through cable, a spacer for the Model 2 Genesis, and 2 electromagnetic shield plates to comply with FCC regulations to reduce RF noise. The 32X was compatible with either the Model 1 or Model 2 Genesis. The pass-through cable had a separate connection that would be needed if you're using the Model 1 Genesis, and is one of the most sought-after cables for the 32X. If you were using a Model 1 Genesis, you also needed to use the 2 electromagnetic shield plates that were included, placing them inside the cartridge slot. If you had a Model 2 Genesis, you would need to attach the spacer, so when you attach the 32X to the Genesis, it would not move. The system would still work without the spacer, but it does wobble a lot. To hook up the system, you would need to connect the AC adapter to your Genesis, connect the pass-through cable from the Genesis to the 32X, connect the AC adapter to the 32X, and then connect the AV cables from the 32X to your television. The system required a lot of connections and had a mess of cables behind it. Also, the AC adapters are large and take up a lot of space on any 6-plug adapter or surge protector. The 32X was able to play 32X game cartridges as well as Sega Genesis game cartridges without removing the add-on. The 32X game cartridges were slightly larger in size and shaped differently than the Sega Genesis carts. The 32X cartridges had a rounded top and dropped the use of end labels when compared to the Genesis cartridges. In North America, Sega branded each media type a different color on packaging and cartridge labels. Sega Genesis was red, Sega CD was blue, and the 32X was yellow. You could also connect your Sega CD to make the Sega CD 32X, which had a few CD games released for it. This also added to the mess of cables behind the system and added a third AC power adapter. I'm going to cover the Sega CD 32X in a separate video. The Sega 32X had around 40 games released for it before it was discontinued. Just to show you what the system was capable of, here's a small sample of some of the titles that were available for the 32X. I'm also going to cover these and more titles in separate reviews.
Lock S-files and attack positions.
Aviators standing by.
They're coming in. 3 marks at 210. Watch it, you've got one on this tail.
Round 2, fight! Finish him! Sub-Zero wins. Flawless victory. Standing. Finish him! Sub-Zero wins. Fatality.
Take that! From downtown! Sweet touch! Plays it up! Fantastic! Oh my!
Overall, I really enjoy the SEGA 32X. I remember getting one in 1994 for Christmas and playing Doom and Star Wars Arcade all night. I didn't really have a ton of games for it back then, but most of the ones I did have were the more popular and liked titles of the system that played really great. I never really experienced any of the more universally hated titles until years later. I did, however, have a really sour taste in my mouth for Sega moving forward when they stopped supporting the 32X just a year after it was launched. I never invested in the Sega Saturn and instead got a Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64 next. I don't think the 32X is a bad system at all. I really enjoy my 32X and I definitely don't think it's one of the worst consoles ever made. The system has a lot of fun games that weren't released on any other console. I think that the whole project was just mishandled by Sega. The Sega Genesis was doing very well in the US and there really wasn't any need at the time to bridge any gap. Also, many of the games were rushed to meet tight production windows. Developers were not able to tap into the entire power of the 32X and instead pushed out inferior products that were incomplete, buggy, or missing entire parts. Sega should have never brought the 32X to market, instead investing all of its assets into the development of the Sega Saturn. Sega damaged its reputation, and many consumers were not going to gamble with a company that looked greedy and incompetent. Once again, this has been Jason with Violator Comics and Collectibles. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. If you like the video, hit the like button, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and I'll see you guys next time.